think we better pray. Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So I'm wondering, how many of you planted a garden this year? Raise your hands. All right, very nice. And how many of you have plants coming up? Raise your hand. Always a good thing. Now raise your hand if you also have had weeds coming up. Yeah, what's with that? More weeds than plants. It's a problem. Weeds are not good in a garden, right? They drain all the nutrients out of the soil and pull them away from the good plants we want growing. And so those plants that we put in don't grow as high, they get kind of stunted. Weeds are a real bane for gardeners. If you want to see someone have a look of terror on their face, tell them that you're planning to plant something in your garden that's kind of invasive, like, I don't know, bamboo. Horror on their face. That's another kind of weed. It's really a grass, right? It's so pretty, but it's a grass. And when it gets in there, apparently it just grows everywhere. You don't want to plant that kind of weed in your garden, even though it's pretty. We've got all kinds of pretty weeds right up here next to me. Aren't they nice? White and sort of dark colored here and some grass. And they're growing here right close to our beautiful flowers. What are we doing with these weeds in church? Well, today is Weed Sunday. It's a little known fact in the liturgical calendar. So if you've got weeds at home, you're right on schedule. I don't know. When I look at weeds in my garden, I feel kind of overwhelmed. What would Santa say if he saw weeds in your garden? Ho, ho, ho. I was hoping somebody would know that joke. Time to get your hoe out and get to work, right? This one's well used. Unfortunately, it's a lot of work, this business with the weeds, trying to get rid of them. And today we have this strange story in the Gospel of Matthew about the wheat and the weeds. They sound kind of the same, but they are similar and yet they're very different, and we definitely like one better than the other, right? It's a strange story because we're told not to do any weeding. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. It's just absurd, right? I mean, anybody who's ever had a garden knows you've got to get those weeds out. And yet, in the story I just read, we were told, don't weed the garden. There are more strange things about that story. I don't know if you notice them. It talks about a homeowner and then also servants. Now, if I were a homeowner with servants, I would have the servants do all the planting. I don't know, it's just me. But in this story, no, it's the homeowner, the owner who's doing all this planting, while I guess the servants just stood around and watched. I don't know. We're also told that the owner planted good seed, which also seems a little strange. I mean, I know some seeds don't grow, but I mean, it sounds like he went to the store and said, well, let's see, should I get some good seed or some bad seed? I think this time I'll plant the good seeds. I mean, what? It's crazy. And then the servants are just standing around watching still. And there's that weird piece about somebody else planting weeds. I mean, honestly, except for people like me who once thought about planting bamboo in my backyard. Who would plant weeds? It doesn't make any sense. This whole story, this whole gospel reading, it just seems absurd to me. And yet there it is. What are we to make of it? Well, further down in that chapter in Matthew, there's an explanation about this story, because apparently I'm not the only one who ever heard the story and thought, what? You know? Same thing happened with the disciples. So when they got Jesus alone in the house, they said, Jesus, can you explain that parable to us? Because it just doesn't make any sense. And Jesus then explained, all right, so the homeowner, that's the Son of Man, or Jesus. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of God. The person who sowed the bad seed, the weeds, that's, we're told, the devil. And those bad seeds are evildoers. And what else? The harvest, that's the close of the age, when the world ends, finally, at the grand finale. And what else happens there? And at the end, the angels will be the ones who come and sort through all the weeds and the wheat, and gather up the weeds and burn them up, and leave the good seeds, the children of God, who will be shining in the sun, happy as anything. And then there's that little piece that makes me uncomfortable about, all those weeds that the angels pull out, all the evildoers, where they're going to get burned up in a big fire, and they're going to weep and gnash their teeth. And I read that passage and I think, I thought God was love. What's with this fiery furnace burning people up and gnashing teeth? Just doesn't fit with what I know about God. So I think here it helps to know that when this passage in Matthew was written, scholars think it came a little later, that Matthew remembered some things that Jesus had said and adapted them, made them fit with the current situation in the world. In that time, the church was having a hard time. They were struggling, and it felt like they were surrounded. There were evildoers in their midst, and they just didn't know what to do about it. And so Matthew, remembering these words he'd heard about, that Jesus had said, kind of wrote a little sermon, actually, and said, don't worry. I know as a church we're worried about all the people who are infiltrating us who maybe are not good enough, but don't worry about it. Don't try to do anything about it. Just sit tight. God's going to take care of it in the end. And so we get this passage in Matthew. But now, of course, it's thousands of years later. And people like me, I look at that and I think, weeds? We can do this. We can get those weeds out. We got tools of all sorts, long ones, short ones, able-bodied people, technology, knowledge. Let's go get those weeds. Let's take care of it and have a beautiful field. Make the whole world just beautiful with not a weed in sight. Let's do that. I'm also the person who thought that sectional couch would fit up the staircase. I confess I'm actually, about a day later, I got to thinking about that couch and the staircase, and I thought, those three movers, those guys, by the end of the day, they were kind of tired. Maybe their brain function wasn't really at full capacity. So I got my tape measure out, and I measured that baby lengthwise. Then I measured the hallway, because I'm thinking, they could have just put it in this way and then yanked it that way. I bet they were trying to turn it or something. They were right. I just used the tape measure. I didn't try to lift the couch itself. I could tell, not going to happen. And of course, I'm crazy to think that I would know better than movers who do this every day how to get a couch up a stair. But, So I'm thinking my eagerness to go out into the world and pull all those weeds and make a beautiful field of everything is probably not a good idea. Maybe the gospel is right. Maybe now is not the time to weed. Because I can't really tell between a weed and wheat or another good plant sometimes. They do look an awful lot alike. I might pull out the good stuff by mistake, and how awful would that be? And of course, I realize in thinking about this that I'm identifying with the homeowner, but maybe I'm actually one of those plants growing in the field. I hope I'm one of the good plants, but I'm not done growing in my faith yet. I'm hoping I'll get better and better. I hope I'm not a weed. That'd be awful. But, how do you know? Maybe I just as soon not get pulled out. I might be a weed. There's a story that a friend of mine and her mother actually talk about all the time. When I was in college, I went to visit this friend and her mother, And we were sitting around the kitchen table, and my friend was talking about some of her other high school friends and some of the poor choices that they'd made and kind of worrying about them. And her mother was sort of talking with her about this too, and I was just listening because I didn't know these high school friends. And then finally my friend said to her mother, "Mom, aren't you glad that I turned out all right?" And her mother looked at her and said, "You haven't turned out yet." Now, they don't remember this conversation, but I thought it was hilariously funny, and I remembered it, and I tell it to them all the time, and now they know the story too in a roundabout way. You haven't turned out yet. All of us, have we turned out yet? No, we're not done yet. There's still more to learn, more to find out about what it means to follow Jesus. We haven't turned out yet. So this is not the time to go pulling those weeds. It's not our job to pull the weeds. We're not qualified. We can't tell a good weed from a bad weed, good plant from a weed. We're not even quite really sure if we're done growing ourselves or what we're going to turn into. So far be it for us to also go out there and pull the weeds and try to excommunicate the people who look like weeds to us, who may or may not be weeds. That's not our job. Who's going to do the weeding? Not you, not me, but God. At the right time, probably a long time from now, I hope, because I need more time to keep growing. At the right time, God will do the judging, the weeding out of the good and the bad plants. And we can trust God, because God knows how to figure those things out. God could get my sectional up the stairs. God can sort through different kinds of plants when the time comes and the time is right. In the meanwhile, as we wait, let us be tolerant. I want to show you, I think we've got a picture to show you on the screen. There it is. That's a sight that ought to terrify any gardener. You can see a few flowers growing in there, some tall purple things, and a whole lot of what I suspect are weeds. But I want to suggest to you that this parable this morning is like this picture here. And the message is that this is all right. God will weed this garden later. Our job now is to grow together. God is merciful. God will give us what we need, even if we are surrounded by weeds, or even if we turn out to be one of those weeds. The kingdom of heaven can be compared to a homeowner who planted good seed, and yet somehow some weeds got in there too and grew up alongside. And that's all right. We don't need to do anything about it. We need except to wait and be tolerant of the people around us and trust that when the time is right, God, who is so very merciful, will do the weeding for us. Who does the weeding? God. God does the weeding. Thanks be to God for that. Amen.